So, did Jesus really rise from the dead? For a historian, that's not just a question of faith, right? It's all about the evidence. And the whole debate really boils down to this. Was the story of the resurrection an actual historical report, or was it a legend that just kind of grew over time? Well, today, we're going to put one of the oldest pieces of evidence we have on trial. All right, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll tackle the legend problem. Then we'll look at an ancient creed that might just be the answer. We'll see how that creed totally compresses the timeline and brings in eyewitnesses. But then we've got to get to the critics and the tough questions they ask. And finally, that'll bring us to the big dilemma every historian faces with this stuff. Ready? Let's get into it. All right, first up, the biggest hurdle for anyone trying to treat the resurrection as history, and that's this idea that the story didn't start out the way we know it. The theory is that it just evolved into a myth over a long, long time. Yeah, this is what's known as the legend theory. The basic idea is that those incredible stories you read in the Gospels, they weren't what people were saying right after Jesus died. Not even close. The theory goes that these stories were passed down by word of mouth for decades, and along the way, the facts got a little blurry and, people added some embellishments. Honestly, the best way to get your head around this is the game of telephone. You know the one, right? You whisper something to one person, they whisper it to the next, and so on, and by the time it gets to the last person in line, the message is just completely mangled. It's nothing like what you started with. Well, the legend theory basically says that is exactly what happened to the story of Jesus. Okay, but what if? What if we found a message from someone who was like second or third in line in that telephone game? This is where a really crucial piece of evidence comes into play. It's an ancient Christian creed, and it looks like it might just stop that whole game of telephone right in its tracks. So, in his first letter to the church in Corinth, the Apostle Paul quotes this really short, punchy statement. And the absolute key part is how he phrases it. He says, "For what I received, I passed on to you." See that? He's not saying, "Hey, I had this amazing vision and here's what I saw." No, he's making it crystal clear that he's just a messenger, a courier. He's delivering a tradition that was already there before him. And because of that wording, scholars, and I mean even scholars who are super skeptical about the resurrection, they pretty much all agree this is the gold standard for what the very first Christians believed. It's like this undisputed time capsule. They call it a pre-Pauline tradition, which is just a fancy way of saying it's a creed, a statement of faith that was being passed around and recited years and years before Paul even sat down to write this letter in the mid-50s. All right, so let's dig into why this is such a game changer. The fact that this creed exists completely crushes the timeline that a legend would need to grow. Just take a look at this timeline. Jesus is crucified around 30 CE. Now, many scholars, people like Gary Habermas, figure that Paul got his hands on this creed only about 5 to 7 years after that. But here's the kicker. The first gospel, the book of Mark, it wasn't written for another 35 years. So what does that mean? It means you have this fully formed creed. Death, burial, resurrection, appearances, the whole shebang, circulating decades before anyone even wrote the Gospels. That huge time gap that the legend theory needs, poof, it just collapsed. So the main argument from apologists is pretty simple. This just doesn't leave enough time for that game of telephone to mess everything up. The story was basically set in stone, formalized way too early. There's just, as they say, insufficient time for some big legend to slowly grow and push out what the actual eyewitnesses remembered. But hold on, it gets even more interesting. This creed doesn't just mess with the timeline. It points to specific people. It actually names names. And this completely changes the conversation. Suddenly, we're not talking about some anonymous myth that just sort of bubbled up out of a community over a few generations. Nope. We're talking about a very specific claim that's tied to a list of real people, people who were still alive at the time and who, theoretically, you could go talk to. And here's the list, straight out of the text. The creed says the risen Jesus appeared first to Peter, the leader of the group, then to the inner circle, the 12, and then, and this is a huge claim, to a crowd of more than 500 people all at once. Then to James, who was Jesus' own brother, then to all the apostles. And finally, Paul says, and to me too. You see, this is not some vague rumor. It's a specific list of supposed witnesses. And this leads right into the next major argument. Scholars like Wolfhart Pannenberg say, look, because this belief is tied to the claims of these specific Jewish people right after Jesus died, the whole idea that they just borrowed it from pagan myths about dying and rising gods, well, it just doesn't make sense. Pannenberg calls it an idle venture. Why? The timeline is way too short, the whole context is Jewish, not pagan, and the claims are tied to real people. Okay, so at this point you might be thinking, case closed, right? An early creed, eyewitnesses, it seems to totally shut down the legend theory. But not so fast. Historians and critics have some pretty powerful comebacks, and they're quick to point out that it's just not that simple. And here's the first big question they throw out there. The whole argument we've been talking about kind of hangs on one big assumption, that legends need a lot of time, decades, to grow. But what if they don't? A critic named Robert Price brings up this fascinating historical example. A guy named Sabbatai Sevi from the 17th century. He claimed he was the Messiah, but then he was forced to convert to Islam. And what happened? Almost overnight, these wild legends started spreading about him. Oh, that wasn't really him who converted, or he secretly ascended to heaven. These stories completely crowded out the actual facts in just a matter of weeks. It's proof that legends don't always creep in slowly. Sometimes they just erupt. And this gets to a really crucial distinction that critics make. They say, look, the creed is fantastic evidence for what the first Christians believed. Nobody disputes that. It proves they had this belief, and they had it early. But, and this is a big but, it doesn't prove the event itself happened. It's evidence of a belief, not evidence of a fact. So what about that amazing eyewitness list? Well, critics have questions about that too. Robert Price, again, he points to that most incredible claim, the appearance to 500 people, and says, that's a little suspicious. And why is it suspicious? Because it's not mentioned anywhere else, not in a single one of the 4 Gospels. He thinks it was probably a later addition, something scholars call an interpolation, or maybe a scribe added it in later to make the case look stronger. So all of this lands us smack in the middle of a huge problem for any historian today who's trying to figure this all out. It's a real dilemma. I mean, just think about it. You have the exact same couple of verses from 1 Corinthians 15. One side looks at that text and says, this is it. This is rock-solid proof. It's the earliest, best evidence we have for the resurrection. But the other side looks at the exact same text and says, this is fascinating proof of a very early belief, but the belief itself is still just a belief. It's not verified history. It's the same data, leading to 2 totally different conclusions. And that leaves us with a really tough question, doesn't it? This ancient creed, it really forces us to think about the limits of what history can even do. It basically closes the time gap that legends need to grow, but it doesn't close that final gap between someone claiming something happened and the thing actually happening. It proves what they believed, for sure, but it can't, all by itself, prove why they believed it. And that makes you wonder, when you're looking at evidence that's ancient and a belief this powerful, how do you even begin to separate the belief from the history?